I'm extremely excited about our next guest, and before I introduce him, I have to tell you a bit of a story, not only why I'm so excited, but why I'm so excited he's on the program today. Our next guest is William Eggers, and he's a very well-known author and a very highly regarded person in the world of government reform and government problem solving. And for those of you who may have seen the show, I have already reviewed his book, which is one of my favorite books. I'm going to hold it up here. It's called If We Can Put a Man on the Moon. And I read this book, and then I did a review on the show because I thought of all the books I've ever read that talk about how to fix things, how to make government better, how to make the world better, whatever, however you want to categorize this genre of books, this is the one that spoke to me. And it spoke to me because there's such a unique way of looking at success and failure in government, and a very unique way of really giving you a path to solving solutions and making government better. So I was already all about If We Could Put a Man on the Moon and William Eggers. And so much, in fact, that in my second book, the second volume of E-Party, which I haven't published yet, hopefully be out this year, I actually feature the book in my book. Because part of E-Party, as you know, is talking about government dysfunction, how to fix government. And my third party, my E-Party, of course, has to fix government. So what they decide to do is actually study William Eggers' book to figure out how they're going to make the world a better place. So I've already done all that. And now last fall I was teaching a class at Columbia University, and I attended another professor's class. I spoke for a few minutes, and then I hung around to attend the rest of the class. And who, of all people in the entire world, is the guest lecturer that day? None other than William Eggers. So I'm a little groupie in the class. Can you be a 64-year-old groupie? I don't know. But I'm a 64-year-old groupie of William Eggers. Here he is speaking to the class, and he's talking about his new book, Solution Revolution. And he's just such a gracious man. I went up after class. We struck up a conversation. He said, of course, I'll be so happy to be on your television show. So that's my long story. But I haven't done the introduction yet. I think we'll do the introduction, through the interview here. But William Eggers, author, very accomplished person in the world of government reform. And he practices professionally through Deloitte. So we're going to talk about his work through Deloitte. If You Could Put a Man on the Moon, and then we're going to hopefully get to the new book, Solution Revolution. So with that, Bill, welcome to the show.
Well, it's great to be with you today. I must confess, I would much rather be with you in Aspen today in the studio instead of here in Washington, D.C., where we're having one of our coldest days of the year so far today. But I guess it is as it is, and I look forward to seeing you live sometime in the Aspen studio in the next year or two.
I would love to see you live. In fact, before the show, we were talking about what a prolific writer you are, and you said you're finishing a new book. So finish the new book, do a book tour, come to Aspen, and that's what we're going to do. We're going to have you on the show live.
Sounds great.
So I gave a brief introduction, but maybe you could fill in some of the blanks. You're with Deloitte, and you are, among other things, responsible for what, thought leadership?
Yeah, that's a kind of a consulting way of just saying essentially the research and publications on government. We do work with governments all over the world, and probably over 70 countries, and in almost every state in the United States and every federal agency. And so my job is to look ahead and understand what some of the trends are, and actually look at what are some of the big problems government officials are facing, and figure out how to fix them and what to do about them through rigorous research and a lot of case studies.
Well, the old expression is, everybody complains about the weather, but no one does anything about it. I think a corollary to that could be everyone complains about the government, but no one does anything about it. How do you decide to be the guy that's going to do something about it?
I've been working on government reform now. It's aging me, but literally for 27 years at this point in time, ever since I graduated college, and I ended up in think tanks and so forth. I always thought I'd do policy work originally, and then some work I was doing at a think tank, it was much more like, how-to sort of stuff around government management and efficiency. And I said, this is important, and no one else seems to be doing this area. And so it was an area that I decided to get into. And, 27 years later, I've been in government, I've been in the private sector, I've been in think tanks, been advisor and commissioner for cities. And this is pretty much the work that I've been doing my entire adult career. And so it's been fascinating just to see some of the trends over time, and also to see some of the intractable problems that don't seem to be getting much better, but then some areas where we've made pretty big gains over the last 2 decades.
So if I do some quick math and I go back 27 years or so, this is the Reagan's president around then?
Oh no, maybe it was Bush was president.
Bush.
Yeah.
Was there a particular aha moment, whether it's part of the a Bush aha moment, or like you said, you're doing a lot of city-based work? Are you working for a particular city at the time when you?
Well, back then there was a big trend of these business-minded mayors that came to power around the country. Dick Reardon in Los Angeles, a former business person. You had Steve Goldsmith, the mayor of Indianapolis, who was a big reformer. You had business-minded mayors in Chicago, and Richie Daley. You had Giuliani in New York City. There was a whole kind of club of them. And what they were doing was, instead of focusing on ideology or just political things, they said, we're going to try to make these cities run better. And we're going to just focus on getting them to run better, more like a business, putting in business practices, reducing crime, getting more people, from welfare into an independent sort of state. And what was interesting was that it was bipartisan. These mayors liked each other. They talked with each other a lot. And in my first book, I wrote a lot about that. It was called Revolution at the Roots, and I profiled a lot of these mayors and some of the governors that were doing this. This was kind of a very big trend, I would say, in the 1990s, around the reinventing government time, where we had a real bipartisan consensus around the need to fix government, make it run better, make it smaller where possible, and so forth. And so that's what really inspired me. And I was living in Los Angeles at the time. I was actually a commissioner for quality and productivity for the city under Mayor Reardon, and also writing about a lot of this. And we're actually seeing today kind of a resurgence in cities of a lot of this sort of innovation and so forth, led in part by Mayor Bloomberg's Bloomberg Philanthropies. And what they've done is they're financing innovation labs in about 24 cities across the country. So there's a lot of energy right now around cities and making cities run better, and particularly around innovation in cities.
So you were actually in government, which I think is very important, that you need to have actually been in government in order to step back and think about how to solve government problems.
Yeah, no, I think it's absolutely necessary, and to go. The best government officials I've seen, in terms of some of the most effective, have had spent time in government, time in the private sector, time in the nonprofit sector. It's actually what some people are calling tri-sector athletes, people who can go lead across the sectors and pull these sectors together, because what it allows you to do is understanding the incentives and the culture in each of those different sectors, and figure out how do we bring the best of that and create value in government. Because government today, if you're a cabinet secretary, you're director of a city office, your job is not just to run your department, but to figure out how to bring a lot of that innovation in from the private sector, the nonprofit sector, social enterprises, and bring it into government to create more value for taxpayers. And what you're doing is you're saving a lot of money that you would have had to spend on taxpayer dollars by doing that, and you're enabling more innovative solutions. And that's why having a view inside the different sectors and seeing what they're all about is, I think, really important. And that's what I advise graduate students today. I say, if you really want to create a lot of public value, if you want to do civic service, it's important to work in government. It's important to, at some point, work in the nonprofit sector and the private sector.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. You know, I did teach a class at Columbia, and I try and point people to government first. I think that's a great place to start. But with you, I also think it's a great place to come back to then maybe 20 years later.
Yeah, no, it can be a wonderful training ground, and also even within government, it can offer a lot of different opportunities. But we need to structure government differently, and we need to create a more of a system that's not based on someone being in government for 35 years and then retiring, but moving in and out of government over the course of their lifetime as they progress, and bringing those other experiences and their relationships and networks to bear on public problems. That's a very different model than we've had over the course of the last 100 years.
And I don't know much about your work at Deloitte. Maybe I should ask you this question. There is the getting into government and solving problems, which obviously people have to do, but then there's perhaps helping government decide just how to think about how to solve problems. Is that more of what you do on the thinking end of things?
Well, you know, in general, I mean, my company Deloitte is the largest professional services firm in the world, and so the amount of work we do in government is pretty big, and it goes all the way from strategy work to operations work to installing IT systems to really getting in there and figuring out how do you solve these really deep and tractable problems. And so what I try to do is help at all of those different stages, and looking at what's working and what's not working around the country. For instance, just did a project in New Mexico recently where it was, how do you reduce the amount of errors and fraud from unemployment insurance, where nationally 1 out of every 10 dollars that goes in unemployment insurance it should not have gone to those individuals in the first place because they were not eligible. Now, rather than having a kind of a punishment driven approach where you're trying to just find fraud, a lot of the times people are just making mistakes, or they're not being completely honest on their forms. And so what we did was we came up with an approach using what's called nudges, which is at different points kind of encouraging people to answer correctly and making sure they're answering correctly, and a lot of more soft sort of nudges in order to reduce those improper payments. And lo and behold, it's worked dramatically, and a very, very big success rate so far. And the state now wants to expand it into many different areas. So that's, you know, a flavor of the sort of work that we may end up doing in different states and federal governments and so forth.
And, well, maybe I didn't ask my question correctly, because again, you've gone in and solved the problem there, right? But it seems to me what you were saying earlier is before you could even go in and solve the problem, you had to have the right framework for people to even approach solving the problem. You had like a macro level solution before you could do the micro.
Well, yeah, I think understanding what the overall approach is. So the book you referenced earlier, Steve, If We Can Put a Man on the Moon, the book had one single big thing that we wanted to do with it, one purpose, and that was to answer this question: why do some government programs fail, and why do some succeed? And the importance of that is huge, because I think a lot of the reduced trust that we have in government today, that citizens have, it's at an absolutely all-time low, is because we've seen a lot of big failures over the last decade or so at the federal level, city level, state level, and people just don't believe government can execute very well today. And so in that book, we looked at close to 100 major government initiatives since World War II, both in the US and around the world. And we mapped them out and looked at them, and we said, what are some of the key ones that succeed? What are the success factors behind that? The ones that fail, what are some of the traps that they tend to fall into? We call that the 7 deadly traps. And then we came up with a model called the Journey to Success, which laid out basically a series of steps that you need to do to be, to have a good chance of success in these big government and these big programs, big initiatives. And so that's a frame. That's by offering a framework that a government official can go about looking at that as they're undertaking one of these big initiatives.
And you've segued nicely to the book, so let's go there. and you've said why you wrote the book. Who were you writing the book for? Who did you expect to read the book and maybe have their own aha moment?
We were writing the book for several audiences. The first one was political leaders, politicians, and others who tend to argue about ideology all the time, and they spend so much time arguing on policy. And our point to them was that, you know what? If you don't think about the execution, if you don't understand whether that policy is designed well to be executed well, you're going to have a failure in the end. And there needs to be a lot more attention thinking through the downstream impacts of any of these policies. And what we also wanted to do was better connect the political side and the bureaucratic side, because increasingly, especially in the US, we'd seen a growing gulf, a growing gap between those who are designing policy and those who are executing it. And so you ended up with all sorts of bills in Congress and state legislatures that were flawed from a design perspective because they were not designed for execution in the real world. Secondly, we wrote the book for those people in government who are attempting to do these big things, initiatives, and just want to understand how to avoid some of the traps involved. We call them kind of the Indiana Joneses of government, because just like Indy, if you're in government, you got to be looking out for the big boulder that's going to be coming down and hit you, or that poison dart, right? And so what we wanted to do is lay out what are all those traps and what can you learn from others who have successfully navigated all of these pitfalls. Because I tell you, Steve, I've been in all three sectors, and it's harder to get big things done in government than the nonprofit sector or private sector. And that's because you've got culture problems, you've got political issues, you've got legislatures, you've got all sorts of other things that the other sectors don't face. And so sometimes it can feel a bit like Sisyphus, rolling this big rock up the hill. And what we wanted to do is make that hill a little less steep for those in government.
Yeah, I know, and you have the Sisyphus, I said that correctly, trap in the book. Why don't you explain what that is?
Well, we all know about the Greek myth of Sisyphus, and Sisyphus essentially was punished by the gods to forever be rolling this boulder up the hill, and he never could quite get it all the way up the hill. And so the Sisyphus trap is really about this feeling that we feel that no matter what we do, we're never going to get to the end, to the finish line in success, right? And oftentimes that's how it can feel when trying to do something big and important in government, because you have kind of the culture issues, the political issues, the leadership, and a lot of those things pushing back against you, making it harder to roll that rock up. And what we talk about all through the book is the importance of people. It doesn't matter whether you're a Republican who wants to do deregulation or of electricity or something, or if you're a Democrat who wants to start up a new program, unless you have good people in there who can execute that and make it happen, it's not going to be successful. And so you have to focus on those people, the people rolling those boulders up the hill, and how do you help to enable them to better be successful in a very, very difficult job that they have.
So you talked about a time earlier when we had these mayors who were, as you call, business-like. They maybe perhaps were problem solvers. They could reach across the aisle. They could build a consensus. I don't want to get into politics with you today, but I take it somewhere along the line we lost that.
Well, it depends on what level. We still see mayors doing this every day. This is what mayors are good at. Mayors have to reach out to the business sector. They have to reach out across the aisle. Mayors are inherently successful ones, pretty good at this because they're closer to government. It tends to be less ideological, usually at the city level, because they just got to get a lot of this stuff done. So I don't think we've lost that at the city level. Now, at the state level, you also have a lot of governors who are more pragmatic, who are really about, I want to solve different problems. I spent time a few months ago in Michigan Governor Snyder comes from the business sector where he was a CEO. He happens to be a Republican, but he's working very closely with the Democratic mayor of Detroit in a partnership to really reinvent Detroit, to fix the problems there, working across the aisle. So I think we do see that at those levels. Where it's broken down, certainly, is at the federal level. And for all sorts of reasons, it has to do with redistricting. It has to do with the fact that members of Congress are worried about being primaried now more than the general election. It has to do with the electorate moving even to places where people have similar beliefs. What we talk about in there is that we call it the Tolstoy syndrome, where we've moved into this sort of place where there's a lot of confirmation bias, that people only want to hear the statistics and they search out the data that confirms what their ideology is or what their hypothesis was, rather than a more scientific approach. And the more we're getting more and more into that sort of a world, the harder it is to actually solve problems. Because if you look across these close to 100 big initiatives that we've looked at over time, most of the successful ones were bipartisan. They involved some element of compromise, and they involved a lot of iteration over time, because you're not always going to get those right. But if you have a system where one side is always, both sides have a lot invested in the other side completely failing, then it gets much harder to have that sort of success. So I think if you look at it that way, the biggest problems in the federal government, a little bit less so at the state level, and less so, even more so, at the city level.
One of the things that I think is a huge problem in government, and I think you saw this play out in Obamacare. I don't want to talk about Obamacare. Well, we can if you want to, but the fact that it was voted all Democrat. To me, there's two problems there. One is, if you have all one side voting for something, it probably means that the other side didn't get a seat at the table and didn't get to bring their ideas to the table, as you said. And then the other thing is, I don't think then you get the long-term buy-in from that other side, that when they are needed to help solve problems down the road, they weren't part of the solution either, and they don't have an interest in fixing it.
Right. The interest is actually all the way down the road, continuing to sabotage it to make sure it's not successful. And that's what we do, point that out in the book. And I actually, the day that the healthcare law was passed, the Washington Post asked me to do a big piece for them, looking at the lessons of history and how to avoid that with healthcare.gov. And I think if you look at some of the more successful ones, we wrote about in the book, acid rain and the reduction in acid rain, and we talked about two senators from across the aisle who actually came together, Tim Wirth from Colorado and Hines from Pennsylvania, Senator Hines, and they came together to forge this compromise and this new approach for reducing acid rain, and they brought their parties with them, and by doing so, both sides had something invested in the success of this. In the case of healthcare.gov, of course, only one side did. And then you ended up with, these are never work in this real world the same way they're going to do legislatively. And so you have to make a lot of changes over time, depending on as you see them working. But if you have a Republican Congress not willing to make any of those changes, then you're in trouble in a way. You have to use executive orders, or even you have to live with an approach that's not as optimal as you would have liked. And so that's why it is important to get that consensus. But it's a lot harder to do so now than it would have been 15, 20 years ago, because essentially, if you're viewed as someone who makes deals, who's good at compromise, who reaches across the aisle, that actually hurts, not helps you now in the primaries in both parties. And you're likely to get primaried because you are not ideologically kind of rigid enough in a way. And so the incentives are lining up the other way. And, we certainly hope that will change, that we'll be looking for more problem solvers going forward. But in this election cycle, I'm not sure that we're seeing that.
Well, you mentioned problem solvers, and another kind of a word for that is leadership. I know at Deloitte you have the a Leadership Institute, And then in your book, you give examples of people who I think just either are great leaders naturally or become great leaders to solve problems. How did we lose that art? Where did we lose leadership skills?
Well, certainly, I think we still see a lot of great leaders out there in the public sector, the private sector, even the nonprofit sector, in a way, who are still persevering through this despite this sort of environment we're in. And as I said, I think we can point to a lot of governors and mayors who are great at this. One of the people we talked about in the book is a guy who I just admire so much. He's about 92 years old right now. His name is Dwight Ink.
I was going to ask you about Dwight Ink. Tell my viewers about Dwight Ink.
I'll just tell you the story. Dwight Ink is almost like the Forrest Gump of the U.S. government for about 40 years, for so many of the big things worldwide, the big changes that happen, big developments. He's the guy who's in the picture, standing right behind the presidents, the guy who actually made these things happen. Starting with Eisenhower and the nuclear test ban treaty, working with President Kennedy, and then Lyndon Baines Johnson had heard about Dwight. He had a reputation, and then we saw the biggest earthquake that occurred in the 20th century in North America, and that was the earthquake in Alaska during the Johnson years. And Dwight told me the story about how he was watching it on TV, and he said to his wife, he turned to his wife and he said, "Boy, I feel really sorry for the poor guy who gets stuck trying to fix that thing." And 2 days later, he gets a call from Johnson, and Johnson puts his big hand on his shoulders and he said, "Dwight, you're going to Alaska. I need you to fix this and the damage of the earthquake, so we don't lose half the population by the next winter." It was one of those incredible challenges. He bore down, though, and he was able to be successful there. And then from there, he was named to other very senior positions during the Nixon years. He was the only execution guy, like the only guy who did implementation, who was part of the White House policy meetings. And Nixon trusted Dwight and put him in there because he wanted to make sure his policies would actually be implemented by the bureaucracy, which, President Nixon didn't trust so much. He had similar important positions with President Ford. And finally, Ronald Reagan named him to head up his transition on kind of government management issues. And then at one point, he made Dwight the drug czar. And Dwight was in Latin America, in Colombia, visiting, and he actually got kidnapped by some of the drug lords as the drug czar. And soon after Dwight finally retired from the federal government after about 30-plus year career, but he was one of those individuals who knew how to get things done in government, and he knew the importance of execution, and he worked for 7 different presidents across party aisles as a civil servant in the White House at the highest levels doing this. And we need more Dwight Inks in government today.
So I know we need more Dwight Inks, and I want to get to your next book, but I told you I was going to ask you this question. So we're going to have a new president in the next November. What would be your advice to that president other than to find yourself a Dwight Ink? Other than read my book and find a Dwight Ink, what's your advice to our new president in terms of fixing whatever you want to fix?
Well, I think it's really, really important. Certainly, first of all, let's think personnel. There's a lot of positions in the federal government where you need people who are really, really good at management and reform and making change happen. It's probably anywhere from 50 to 100 positions, whether it's the FEMA director or the head of NASA or at Office of Management and Budget, the person who runs management, where you just need the best and brightest for these positions, and not political types necessarily, but people who know how to get things done. And I would focus a lot of time and attention on recruiting and bringing those people into government and making sure that they have good teams with them. But secondly, you need then the civil service. The civil service has been fairly demoralized over the last few decades because of the increase in political appointees and because we haven't asked them to do a lot of the important things that they used to do. And I would really make a big point of trying to reinvigorate our senior executive service and our civil service, bring new energy into them, give them a lot new important things to do, reduce some of the layers between the civil servants and the top political appointees, because that's going to be really important. And third, as my new book points out, we're living in a digital age today. And getting things done digitally, as we saw with healthcare.gov, making those things happen is radically different in terms of how you do design and delivery than traditional government programs. And we need to understand that. And that means we need to be bringing in a lot more of the best and brightest technologists from Silicon Valley and Boston and Austin and elsewhere into government. And we need to be reaching out much more to those tech companies and others to help government with designing the best and brightest. People always say, why isn't there a Google for government? Or why doesn't government operate like Amazon? Why don't we see more sort of government apps that are more like Uber? Well, we should be able to see that, but it's going to take a different set of talent than we necessarily have today. And that's what my next book, which is called Delivering on Digital, is all about, which is policy, design, and delivery in the digital age and how different that is in getting these things done than we would have seen over the last, hundreds of years.
So I want to get to the new book, and I don't want to jump over a solution revolution either. But it seems to me you are onto a new front now. You're not just focusing on government as a place to solve problems, and when you want to solve government problems, you want to do it differently. But you're looking broader now. You're looking at these synergies between business and NGO and government, and then you're using new talents, as you said, technology, the internet. And it seems to me you're looking across just the globe now too. You don't want people only look within the United States. Let's look around the world.
Right. I actually wrote a book with the former mayor of Indianapolis and Bloomberg's former deputy mayor, Steve Goldsmith, about 11 years ago, called Governing by Network, which kind of laid the groundwork for thinking about government, not just in terms of what's inside your four walls, but saying how do we create much more value through all of these partnerships and networks with the private sector, the nonprofit sector, and so forth. So that was a way of thinking about government in a different way. That book's been used in dozens and dozens of graduate schools for over a decade. So that journey started a long time ago. And with Solution Revolution, we wrote that because we started looking around and saying, you know what, the landscape for solving societal problems is radically different now than it was 15 years ago, even when we were writing Governing by Network. Why? It's because the universe of people who are involved in solving problems has expanded exponentially. It used to just be basically government and nonprofits, and that was pretty much it. And most of the nonprofits were fairly small. Today, you have all these big mega foundations like the Gates Foundation, the Midyar Network, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, billion-dollar-plus foundations are like Gates, $30 billion, that are actually saying we're going to solve the malaria problem, or we're going to solve the obesity problem. We're going to actually be at the forefront. We'll bring government in, nonprofits in, but we're going to help coordinate that. That is incredible development, and there's dozens of those sort of mega foundations in the U.S. And then you have businesses, what we call double, triple bottom line businesses. We call them multirational, multinationals. And we've got dozens and dozens of companies that are out there saying, we want to be playing a big role in solving the problem of water scarcity or clean water in Africa or malaria or other sort of issues. And again, we didn't see that before, because back a decade or two ago, most businesses just adhered to Milton Friedman's admonition, which is the role of government business is simply to focus on shareholder value, and anything else like that is doing a disservice to them. Companies aren't thinking like that so much anymore. We've seen a big movement towards looking at their social impact. And then we've seen this. Every city in the country, you see these incubators with all sorts of social startups and others where the best and brightest from business schools, other graduate schools, and entrepreneurial people are increasingly saying, we actually want to create companies and create enterprises to solve problems, whether it's education, to transportation, to healthcare, to obesity, to food waste, and they're scaling those. We call them born social companies. And if you look at Fast Company's list of like the 100 fastest growing, most innovative companies, 30% of those companies are what we call born social, where they have a social focus, a focus on solving some societal problem as their major sort of mission and area. Again, that's unprecedented. So we wanted to write about that because government is no longer alone in societal problem solving. It has all these other organizations as part of the landscape, and the best governments are the ones that understand that and reach out and partner with them.
So I'm going to say, like the classic chicken and egg question comes first here. What comes first? Government can't function properly and these people step in to fill the void, or these people see the need to step the void and then government willingly comes along to be their partner?
That's a great question. It's a little bit of both. It depends on where you happen to live and operate. But in many cases, what we've seen is citizen expectations going up like this. Government revenues, government's ability is about flat. And so there's a big gap between the two. And all these organizations are stepping into that void. But on the other hand, the areas where we're seeing the most innovation and the most growth of all this is in countries where the government is saying, we're not going to fight this. We're not going to try to compete against these organizations. What we're going to do is try to facilitate their growth because it's so important. And we understand that there's always going to be more innovation outside of our four walls than inside of it. And so the two countries that have taken the biggest leadership around what we call creating these solution economies are in the UK under David Cameron. So you've got a center-right Tory government, which has done all sorts of initiatives to create the infrastructure for these organizations to flourish. They're creating a market for social outcomes, is what they call it. And then the other country that's been at the top on this is the US under the Obama administration, a center-left government, where since President Obama came to power, they've done over 400 prizes and challenges from federal agencies where they've opened up some of their biggest problems for anyone in the world to solve. Every office, every agency now is an office of public-private partnerships. They have a social innovation fund. They're trying to seed these sort of things all over the country. They have an office in the White House of social innovation. Very few governments have done even a fraction as much as the Obama administration has done to really try to drive these sort of initiatives. And so that's one of the things I love about it. It's one of the few areas today that where you have bipartisan support for. And you'll see bills in Congress around Pay for Success and others supporting this that tend to have very strong bipartisan support. And I think that's only going to continue to grow no matter who the next president is.
Well, you've been a great guest and time always flies. My advice to the next president is going to be find yourself a new Dwight Inc. by the name of William Eggers. Bring him in and just get out of his way. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Steve. It was a pleasure being with you today. I really had a lot of fun.
All right, when the next book comes out, we're doing it in Aspen, right?
Great. Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Thank you and all the best.
Thank you.